The only light in the dungeon was the flicker of her single candle, and the only sound was the rattle of chains as she passed the last bowl of broth through the iron bars. Ilara was an Omega, the lowest rank in the Frostfang pack, and this was her greatest crime, feeding the broken prisoners left to starve in the dark. She didn't know the man in the deepest cell, the one with the scarred face and the silent, watching eyes, was the missing Alpha King of the rival Blood Moon territory. And she had no idea that when he finally broke free, he would tear her world apart to find the one who showed him mercy. In the rigid hierarchy of the Frostfang pack, Omegas like Ilara are meant to be silent, obedient, and invisible. Their Alpha Kirin rules through fear, and his dungeons are filled with enemies real and imagined. But one prisoner is different. He was captured in a bloody border skirmish months ago, his identity a secret even from his jailers. And every night, the lowest member of the pack risks everything to keep him alive, unknowingly setting a fuse on a powder keg that will shatter their world. Ilara's world was defined by 3 rules: obey without question, speak only when spoken to, and never, ever look an alpha in the eye. For 5 years, since her parents died in a winter famine, she had navigated this invisible cage. Her days were a blur of menial labor, scrubbing stone floors, mending uniforms, and most recently, being assigned the dreaded dungeon detail. It was a punishment duty, reserved for those who had displeased the pack's beater, Gareth. Ilara's crime had been minor. She had been seen reading a discarded book on herbology in the kitchen after hours. Knowledge, for an Omega, was considered a dangerous affectation. The Frostfang pack's stronghold was a grim granite fortress built into the side of a mountain, perpetually shrouded in mist and cold. Its power came not from wealth or diplomacy, but from control of a narrow, vital pass through the mountains. Alpha Kirin maintained that control through sheer brutality. His enforcers were feared, his judgments were swift, and his dungeons were always full. Political dissidents, traders who charged too much, and rivals from smaller packs all found themselves chained in the dark. The official line was that they were interrogated for threats. The truth was simpler: they were examples. The dungeon was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of wet stone and rusting iron 2 levels beneath the great hall. The air was thick with the smells of mildew, stagnant water, and despair. Ilara's task was basic. Once a day, after the guards had made their rounds, she was to collect the empty food pails from the previous meal. That was all. The prisoners were fed a thin, grey gruel by the guards themselves. The Omegas were not trusted to interact with them. On her 3rd day, Ilara saw the gruel. It was more water than oat, often spoiled, with bits of mold floating on the surface. She watched a guard toss a bowl through the bars of the last cell, the contents splashing across the straw-strewn floor. The man inside didn't move toward it. He just stared at the wall, his breathing shallow. That night she couldn't sleep. The image of that wasted food and the man's hollow eyes haunted her. A memory surfaced, her mother's voice during that long-ago famine. "No one deserves to starve," she had said, dividing their last loaf with a stranger. The next evening, Ilara acted. She saved half of her own meager dinner, a piece of hard bread and a wedge of cheese, and hid it in the folds of her tunic. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she descended the dungeon stairs, expecting a shout, a hand on her shoulder. The guard on duty, a hulking man named Rourke, was half asleep at his post. She moved past him like a shadow, her candle the only bobbing light in the profound blackness. She stopped at the last cell. The man was as still as stone. She pushed the bread and cheese through the gap at the bottom of the bars, then quickly retreated. She didn't wait to see if he took it. The risk was already catastrophic. If caught, the punishment would be a public lashing, or worse, being cast out into the frozen wilderness. But the next day, the food was gone. And so a silent routine began. Every night she would bring what she could spare: a crust of bread, a bit of broth smuggled in a small flask, a strip of dried meat. She never spoke, he never acknowledged her. He was just a shape in the darkness, a silhouette of broad shoulders and matted hair. The other prisoners were noisy, they begged, they cursed, they wept. This man was different. His silence wasn't defeat. It felt like a coiled spring, a watchful, patient kind of waiting. The guards called him the Stone Wolf and seemed to give his cell a wider berth. A week into her secret mission, she noticed the chains. They were not ordinary irons. They were thick, rune-etched silver, bolted not just to the wall, but deep into the stone floor itself. Silver was poisonous to their kind, causing a slow, burning agony. Whoever this prisoner was, Kieran wasn't just containing him, he was torturing him. One night, as she passed the flask of broth through the bars, a low, gravelly voice spoke from the darkness. It was the first human sound she'd heard from him in all these weeks. Why? The single word, raw from disuse, froze her in place. She saw his eyes then, reflecting her candle flame. They weren't the dull eyes of a broken man. They were sharp, intelligent, and held a ferocity that made her blood run cold. She found her voice, a mere whisper, because it's wrong. A long pause, then the sound of the flask being dragged across the stone. You are an Omega. It wasn't a question, it was an observation that carried the weight of a judgment. She simply nodded, too terrified to elaborate. From that night on, he would take the offering and sometimes utter a single word. Cold, or names. She learned the guards never used his real name. He had been stripped of it. She learned he had been beaten, not for information, but for sport. The pieces formed a terrifying picture. This wasn't just any enemy. He was someone Alpha Kieran was deeply, personally afraid of. Her curiosity became a dangerous companion. She began to listen, to piece together whispers. The pack was on edge. Talks with the powerful Blood Moon territory to the east had broken down. There were rumors of a missing leader, a king who had vanished while surveying the border months ago. The Blood Moon wolves were furious, blaming Frostfang for an ambush. Skirmishes were increasing. Kieran was mobilizing his fighters, preparing for a war he could not possibly win against a larger, richer, and more organized territory. The truth clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The rune-etched silver, the extreme secrecy, the beatings meant to degrade, not interrogate. The prisoner in the last cell wasn't just a soldier, he was a prize. He was Kashan, the Alpha King of Blood Moon. Ilara's world tilted. She was feeding the most powerful wolf in the Eastern Territories, a king her Alpha had kidnapped and tortured. This was no longer an act of compassion. It was an act of treason that would get her executed. That night, her hands shook so badly she spilled the broth. She expected him to say something, to confirm her horrifying deduction. He said nothing. He just watched her, those intense eyes missing nothing. The very next day, the atmosphere in the stronghold shifted. Alpha Kieran called a full pack assembly in the Great Hall. Ilara stood at the very back, head bowed. Kieran, a man with ice-blonde hair and eyes like chips of flint, stood on the dais. The Blood Moon curs are massing at our border, he roared. They bark and snarl, demanding we return something we do not have. This is not a negotiation. It is a pretext for invasion. He promised glory, he promised the spoils of war, but his eyes were wild, desperate. He was lying. He knew exactly what Blood Moon wanted, and he had no intention of giving it back. The assembly ended with a chorus of aggressive howls, but Ilara felt only a creeping dread. War was coming, and the key to stopping it was wasting away in the dark, surviving only on her stolen scraps. That evening, dungeon duty felt like walking into a tomb. Guard Rourke was not asleep. He was alert, and he was not alone. Beta Gareth stood beside him, his arms crossed, a cruel smile on his thin lips. Ilara's heart stopped. The Omega, Gareth said, his voice oily. We've noticed a change in the last prisoner. He's stronger, more alert. It's curious. He took a step toward her. You've been down here every night. You see things. Has he spoken to you? Ilara's mouth went dry. She forced herself to look at the floor. No, Beta, he is silent. Gareth leaned in, his scent of stale wine and aggression overwhelming. You're a terrible liar. If I find out you've been touching what belongs to the Alpha, your kindness will be the last thing you ever feel. He grabbed her chin, forcing her head up. Look at me when I'm talking to you, you little mouse. In that moment, a sound echoed from the depths of the dungeon. It was the deep, resonant scrape of metal on stone, then a low, unmistakable growl that vibrated through the very floor. It came from the last cell. Gareth released her, his face paling slightly. He and Rourke exchanged a nervous glance. The prisoner had never made a sound like that before. It wasn't the growl of an animal. It was the clear, warning growl of a wolf, a dominant. Get out, Gareth snapped at Ilara, his attention fully diverted by the new threat in the dark. She fled, her legs weak, but as she reached the stairs, she heard Kashan's voice, calm and clear, carry down the corridor. It was a question directed not at her, but at the Beta. Gareth, the imprisoned king, called out. Does your alpha know you fear the dark? The question hung in the damp air, a psychological knife twisted in the silence. Ilara didn't wait for the answer. She ran, knowing the fragile piece had just shattered. The stone wolf was no longer just watching, he was engaging, and his first move was to protect her. The echo of Cashin's voice followed Ilara all the way to the servants' quarters, a ghost in her mind that whispered of a dangerous new alliance. Fear was a cold stone in her stomach. Gareth would not forget that challenge. He would come looking for the source of the prisoner's newfound defiance, and his suspicion would land squarely on her. For 3 days, she avoided the dungeon entirely, pleading a fever to the head cook. She spent those days in a state of paralyzed anxiety, jumping at every footstep, expecting Gareth's enforcers to drag her away. But they didn't come. Instead, a different tension settled over the stronghold. The guards were jumpy. Conversations in the hallways ceased when she walked by. She overheard 2 kitchen beaters whispering about increased patrols and strange sounds from the lower levels. Something had changed. Cashin's single-spoken sentence had been a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples were disturbing the entire pack. On the 4th night, curiosity and a gnawing sense of responsibility overpowered her fear. She had to know if he was still alive. Gareth's threat implied worse tortures. She scraped together a small parcel of food, a stolen apple, a heel of bread, and heart-hammering, descended the familiar stone steps. The dungeon was colder, quieter. Guard Rourke was at his post, but he was wide awake, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. He glared at her as she passed. "Make it quick, Omega, no lingering." His tone was nervous, not cruel. She hurried past, her candle flame guttering in a sudden, icy draft that had no business being that deep underground. She reached the last cell. Cashin was not slumped against the wall. He was standing at the bars, his hands gripping the iron as if he had been waiting. The dim light revealed more of him than she had ever seen. The matted dark hair, the beard that couldn't hide the sharp line of his jaw. The scars were not just from beatings. Some were old, silvery marks across his chest and arms, the stories of a warrior. But it was his eyes that held her. The amber glow was brighter, a banked fire now stirring to life. The silver chains on his wrists were still there, but they seemed thinner, as if they were being worn down not by time, but by sheer, relentless will. "You came back," he said. His voice was stronger, clearer. The raw gravel was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant timbre that commanded the space between them. "I had to know if you were," she trailed off, unable to say the word. "If Gareth had killed me," a faint, grim smile touched his lips. "He is too afraid of what I might say to his alpha to kill me. For now, your bread gave me strength. Your broth cleared my head, thank you." Hearing gratitude from him was more disorienting than his anger. She shoved the parcel through the bars. "What did you mean, asking if he fears the dark?" Cashin took the food, his fingers brushing against hers. A jolt like static shot up her arm. He felt it too, his eyes flared brighter for a second. "Fear is a weapon," he explained quietly, his gaze fixed on the corridor where Rourke sat. "Men like Gareth rule through the fear of others, but they are cowards at their core. They fear the dark because in the dark they cannot see what's coming for them." I simply reminded him of that. He was playing a game, a deadly, psychological game with the beater of the pack. Ilara's mind reeled. "They're talking about war. Alpha Kieran says the Blood Moon pack is massing at the border." A dark satisfaction flashed in Cashin's eyes. "Lysander," he murmured, the name full of pride. "My beater, he is not a man who makes empty threats." So it was true, he was the Alpha King. The confirmation should have terrified her more. Instead, a strange calm settled over her. She was already committing treason. Knowing the full scale of it was almost liberating. What will he do? "He will give Kieran a chance to surrender me," Cashin said, his voice turning to ice. "And when Kieran lies and says he doesn't have me, Lysander will tear this mountain apart stone by stone to find me. He will not stop, not until every Frostfang wolf is subdued or dead." The image was horrifying. The stronghold in flames, her packmates, even the cruel ones slaughtered. There has to be another way. Cashin studied her, his head tilted. "You care for them after how they treat you." "They're my pack," she whispered, the truth complex and painful. "It's all I have." For a long moment he was silent. Then he spoke, his voice low and urgent. "There is a way, but it requires a great risk from you, little Omega, greater than smuggling bread." Ilara leaned closer, the candlelight dancing between them. "Tell me." "The chains," he said, holding up his wrist. The runes on the silver glinted dully. "They are spelled. The magic is fueled by a source stone, a black obsidian about the size of your fist. It's kept in Kieran's private study on the mantelpiece. It draws its power from proximity. If it is removed from the stronghold, or even just from this level, the spells weaken, enough that I could break them." Steal from Alpha Kieran's private study, it was a suicide mission. The study was guarded day and night, accessible only to Kieran and Gareth. "I can't get in there," she breathed. "You are an Omega," Cashin said, not unkindly. "You are invisible. Who notices a servant cleaning ashes from a hearth? You have access to the upper halls for cleaning duties, do you not?" She did, once a week. She was part of the team that cleaned the corridor outside the Alpha's quarters. The study door was always closed, locked. But the fireplace, the chimney shared a flue with the smaller fireplace in the adjacent vacant guest chamber. A desperate, insane idea began to form. It was impossible. It was the only chance. "If I do this," she said, her voice trembling, "if I get the stone, what then?" Cashin's gaze burned into her. "Then you get as far from this cell as you can. You run to the eastern wall. When the chaos starts, you stay low. My men will be coming from that direction. Show them this." He reached through the bars, his movements slow so as not to startle her. With a fingernail hardened like a claw, he scored a simple, quick symbol onto the wooden base of her candle holder, a mountain peak with a crescent moon behind it, the sigil of Blood Moon. "They will know you are under my protection. They will keep you safe." He was offering her salvation, a way out of this frozen hell. All she had to do was betray her pack entirely and trust the word of a chained king. She looked from the sigil to his eyes, seeing no deceit, only a fierce, unwavering promise. "I'll try," she whispered. A sharp shout echoed from the dungeon entrance. "Omega, your time is up," it was Rourke. Cashin's hand withdrew. "Go and be careful of Gareth. He is sniffing around. He knows something has changed." Ilara fled, the carved sigil on her candle holder feeling like a brand. The next day, her cleaning rotation was assigned. She was to clean the upper north corridor, which included the guest chamber next to Kieran's study. Fate, or cruel irony, was giving her a chance. The plan was terrifyingly simple and fraught with peril. The guest chamber was unused, its fireplace cold. The flue shared with the study would be narrow, filthy, and possibly blocked, but it was a direct path to the mantelpiece. That afternoon, as the other Omegas dusted and swept, Ilara volunteered to clean the guest room hearth. She waited until the corridor was momentarily empty, then, with a deep breath, she squeezed into the fireplace. It was a tight fit, even for her small frame. Soot coated her clothes and skin immediately. The brick was rough and cold. She crawled upward, the darkness swallowing her. After what felt like an eternity, she saw a faint glimmer of light from above, the study fireplace. Peering through the iron grate, she saw the room. It was opulent in a severe way, furs on the floor, weapons on the walls, a massive oak desk. And there on the stone mantelpiece sat the source stone. It was just as Cashin had described, a lump of black obsidian pulsing with a faint, sickly violet light. Her heart leaped. It was right there. The grate was fixed from the other side, but the mortar around it was old and crumbling. She pulled the small metal scraper she used for cleaning from her belt and began to pick at the edges, her every sound echoing terrifyingly in the chimney. Just as a chunk of mortar gave way and the grate loosened, she heard the study door open. She froze, clutching the sooty bricks, barely daring to breathe. "The scouts confirm it," came Alpha Kieran's voice, hard and angry. "Lysander has the entire Blood Moon war host assembled 5 miles from the pass. He's given us until dawn tomorrow to produce Cashin." "Then we kill the king tonight," Gareth's voice replied. "We dump his body at the border, say we found him murdered by rogues. Without proof, Lysander's cause for war falls apart." Ilara's blood turned to ice. "No," Kieran said, and to her surprise, he sounded almost weary. "Lysander is not a fool. He would smell the lie, and a dead king makes a martyr. A living prisoner is a bargaining chip. We move him tonight. There's an old watchtower half a day's ride north. We take him there hidden, let Lysander storm an empty fortress. We hold Cassian until his pack stands down. And the Omega, the one who's been feeding him, she's a loose end. Find her, silence her permanently, make it look like an accident, a fall in the kitchen cellar. The conversation continued, planning the logistics of moving a high-value prisoner, but Elara heard nothing else. The words "silence her" rang in her ears. She had run out of time. They were going to move Cassian and kill her. Now. Driven by pure panic, she waited until she heard the door shut and lock. With frantic strength, she pushed the loose grate. It gave way with a screech of rusted iron that sounded deafening to her. She tumbled out into the study, landing in a cloud of soot on the fur rug. She was in the lion's den. The obsidian stone pulsed on the mantel. She scrambled to her feet, grabbed it, and shoved it into the deep pocket of her apron. It was shockingly cold, sapping the warmth from her fingers instantly. She had to get out. The door was locked. The only way was back up the chimney or... Her eyes fell on the large window. It was leaded glass, but one of the panes was cracked. Without thinking, she picked up a heavy marble paperweight from the desk and hurled it. The glass shattered with an appalling crash. Shouts erupted from the corridor, the Alpha's study. Elara didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the desk and threw herself through the broken window, tumbling out onto the narrow, icy ledge of the battlement. A two-story drop to the frozen courtyard below. The wind whipped at her, threatening to pluck her off. She edged along the ledge, toward a drainage pipe she knew was there, her fingers numb. Behind her, the study door burst open. She heard Gareth's roar of fury. "The stone is gone, find her." Elara grabbed the iron pipe and slid, her hands tearing on the rough metal. She hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. The obsidian stone felt like a block of ice against her leg. She had it, but now the entire pack was alerted. Gareth's enforcers would be swarming within seconds. Her only hope was the dungeon, to get the stone close enough to weaken the chains before they moved Cassian. She pushed herself up and ran, not towards safety, but deeper into the heart of the stronghold, toward the one person who might be able to turn the coming storm. The alarm bell began to toll, a harsh, clanging sound that shattered the mountain's silence and turned the stronghold into a hive of furious activity. Elara ran, her breath soaring in her lungs, her path a desperate zigzag through service corridors and storage rooms. Shouts echoed everywhere. "Secure the gates! Find the girl!" Her description was already on their lips, the Omega with soot on her face. She was a ghost who had suddenly become the most wanted creature in the fortress. The stone in her pocket was a dead weight, its unnatural cold seeping through the fabric and into her skin, making her thigh ache. But as she neared the staircase leading down to the dungeon, a strange thing happened. The violet pulse within the obsidian began to flicker like a guttering candle. The closer she got to Cassian's cell, the weaker the light became. He was right. The magic was tied to proximity. She skidded to a stop at the top of the dungeon stairs. Two guards she didn't recognize were barring the way, their spears crossed. "No one goes down," one growled. "Beta's orders." She had to think. She was just an Omega. She had no authority, no power, but she had the one thing they were all panicking about. An idea, reckless and born of sheer terror, sparked. She let the fear show on her face, made her body tremble. "Please," she gasped, her voice a high-pitched whisper of panic. "The Beta, he needs this taken to the prisoner now. He said it's the only thing that will calm him before the move." She pulled the obsidian stone halfway from her pocket, letting its eerie, fading light glint for just a second. The guards stared at the stone, then at each other, confusion and fear warring on their faces. They'd heard of the Source Stone, a thing of the Alpha's power. "Gareth sent you?" one asked, dubious. "Who else?" Elara pleaded, tears welling in her eyes, real tears of exhaustion and fear. "He said if I don't get this down there immediately, the prisoner might break loose before the transport is ready. Do you want to be responsible for that?" The threat of the stone wolf breaking free was the ultimate motivator. The guards uncrossed their spears, stepping aside with nervous haste. "Be quick." She flew down the stairs, her soft shoes silent on the stone. The dungeon was in an uproar. Rourke and 3 other enforcers were at Cassian's cell, preparing heavy manacles and a blindfold. Cashin was on his feet, his body a tense line of resistance, but the chains still held him fast. The runes on the silver glowed with that same sickly violet light, but the glow was stuttering, unstable. Rourke saw her first. "You, how did you get?" His eyes dropped to the stone in her hand, its light now barely a faint shimmer, his face contorted in rage. "Thief." Ilara didn't stop. She sprinted the last few yards and slammed the obsidian stone against the cold iron bars of the cell. The effect was instantaneous and violent. A sound like shattering glass, felt more than heard, echoed through the dungeon. The violet light in the runes winked out completely. The obsidian stone in her hand turned dull and inert, just a piece of black rock. And the silver chains on Cashin's wrists and ankles didn't just unlock, they exploded. Shards of molten silver flew outward, sizzling where they hit the wet stone floor. Cashin threw his head back and roared. It was not a human sound. It was the full-throated, earth-shaking cry of an Alpha King unleashed. The pressure of his dominance, so long suppressed by the spelled silver, erupted like a volcano. The four enforcers in the corridor were thrown backward as if hit by a physical wave, crashing into the opposite wall. Rourke's head struck stone with a sickening crack, and he slid down, unconscious. Cashin stepped forward, the broken chains falling from him like dead snakes. He grabbed the iron cell door. With a screech of protesting metal, he bent the bars apart, creating an opening wide enough to pass through. He emerged into the corridor, a figure of terrifying primal power. His amber eyes burned like twin suns in the dungeon's gloom, sweeping over the stunned enforcers before landing on Ilara. For a second, she was more afraid of him than she had ever been of Gareth. This was not the shackled, silent prisoner. This was a force of nature. Then his gaze softened just a fraction. "The stone, you did it." He reached for her not to harm, but to usher her behind him. "Stay close." But the momentary shock was wearing off. The two guards from the top of the stairs came charging down, weapons drawn. Shouts from above indicated more were coming. They were trapped in a bottleneck. Cashin moved. It was a blur of lethal efficiency. He disarmed the first guard, snapped the spear in two, and used the broken shaft to disarm the second. He didn't kill them. He incapacitated them with precise, brutal strikes to the legs and shoulders, leaving them moaning on the ground. He fought with a controlled fury, every motion designed to disable, not slaughter. He was conserving his energy, but he was also holding back. "Why aren't you killing them?" Ilara breathed, pressed against the wall. "A dead pack is a vengeful pack," he grunted, tossing a guard aside. "A broken pack can be rebuilt." He grabbed a set of keys from Rourke's belt. "The other cells, now." He began unlocking doors, flinging them open. The bewildered, half-starved prisoners stumbled out. "Listen to me," Cashin's voice boomed, commanding absolute attention. "Your Alpha is a kidnapper and a liar. He has brought war to your doorstep to hide his crime. I am Cashin, Alpha of Bloodmoon. Fight for him and die for his pride. Lay down your arms and you will live. Spread the word. The king is free." It was a masterstroke. He wasn't just escaping. He was launching a psychological attack from within Kieran's own stronghold. The prisoners, a mix of Frostfang dissenters and rival pack members, didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled up the stairs, some grabbing fallen weapons, their shouts of "the king is free." And Kieran lied, spreading chaos into the levels above. Cashin grabbed Ilara's hand. "Now we go to the eastern wall." But as they reached the top of the dungeon stairs, they ran not into more guards, but into a solid wall of them. And at their front stood Alpha Kieran and Beta Gareth. Kieran's face was a mask of cold, furious calm. In his hand was not a weapon, but a heavy, leather-bound ledger. Gareth held a drawn sword, his smile vicious. The corridor was packed with at least 20 enforcers, blocking any path to the outer walls. "A noble speech, Cashin," Kieran said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Turning my prisoners against me, but you've made one critical error." He held up the ledger. "You brought the little mouse with you." Cashin stepped in front of Ilara, a growl rumbling in his chest. "She is under my protection." "Is she?" Kieran's eyes glinted. "She is a Frostfang Omega. Her life, her loyalty, is mine to command. And she has a family, doesn't she, Gareth?" Gareth's smile widened. "Oh yes, an aunt. a sickly, frail thing in the lower village, and a younger cousin, what was his name? Finn, bright boy. Ilara's heart stopped. Her Aunt Marin and cousin Finn were her only living blood relatives. They were powerless civilians. Kieran hadn't just been chasing her, he had been researching her. "Here is my offer, Blood Moon King," Kieran said, his tone turning businesslike. "You surrender yourself peacefully. You come back to your cell without another broken bone. My men will escort you to the border watchtower, and we will negotiate with your beta like civilized beings. In return, the Omega lives. Her family lives. She will be punished, of course, but she will breathe." He was using her as a hostage. Cashin's greatest weapon, his mercy, his refusal to slaughter needlessly, had been turned against him. The Alpha King stood utterly still, but the rage coming off him was a palpable heat. He was caught. To fight his way out would mean condemning Ilara and her innocent family to death. Ilara looked from Kieran's smug face to Cashin's rigid back. She saw the impossible choice paralyzing him. He would do it. He would surrender himself to save her. All her work, all his suffering would be for nothing. The war would happen anyway, but with Cashin back in chains, Blood Moon would be leaderless and desperate. No! The word rose up in her, not as a thought, but as a certainty. She had spent her life being a pawn. She would not be the piece that checkmated a king. Before Cashin could speak, she stepped out from behind him. She met Kieran's eyes directly, breaking the most sacred Omega rule. "Alpha Kieran," she said, her voice clear and ringing in the tense silence, "you are a coward." A shocked gasp went through the enforcers. Gareth took a threatening step forward, but Kieran held up a hand, his expression one of fascinated malice. "You hide behind the weak. You chain those stronger than you. You steal and lie and call it strength." She was repeating Cashin's words, the truths she had learned in the dark. "You are not an alpha. You are a thief in an alpha's skin, and I am not yours to command." She turned to Cashin, her eyes pleading for him to understand, and then she did the one thing he would not expect. She ran, not toward freedom, but straight at the wall of enforcers between her and the narrow staircase that led to the battlements. "Stop her!" Kieran roared. The enforcers moved to grab her, but her sudden, suicidal charge caused a moment of confusion. Cashin, understanding her sacrifice, let out a roar of pure anguish and unleashed himself upon the guards blocking his path to her, trying to cut his way through. Ilara ducked under a grasping arm, slipped between two men, and bolted up the tight, winding stair to the top of the eastern wall. The cold night air hit her like a slap. The wall was deserted. Every fighter was being mobilized below. She ran to the parapet, looking out over the sheer drop to the rocky slopes below, and then across the dark expanse to the distant tree line. And there she saw them, hundreds of pinpricks of light, like a field of amber stars moving in the darkness. The Blood Moon War host. They were much closer than 5 miles. They were at the very foot of the mountain. Lysander hadn't waited for dawn. Hope, fierce and terrifying, exploded in her chest. She fumbled for the candle holder still tucked in her belt, the one with Cashin's sigil carved into it. There was no time to light it. Instead, she raised it high above her head, a small, foolish silhouette against the night sky, and began waving it back and forth, screaming into the wind with all her might. It was a futile, desperate gesture. A hand closed on her shoulder, yanking her backward. Gareth, his face was twisted with triumph. "Time to fly, little mouse," he snarled, and shoved her hard toward the parapet's edge. Ilara screamed, windmilling her arms as she tumbled over the stone edge into open air. The fall was a blur of rushing wind and terror, but it was not the long, fatal drop to the rocks. She fell only about 10 feet before landing with a bone-jarring thud on a lower, sloping roof of the guardhouse below the wall. She slid down the slick shale tiles, scrambling for purchase, and tumbled off the edge again, landing in a deep snowdrift beside the outer wall. She was outside the stronghold. Gareth's face appeared over the battlement above, furious. He shouted for archers. But his shouts were drowned out by a new sound, a sound that began as a low, rolling thunder and built into a deafening chorus. It was the sound of hundreds of wolves howling in unison, the Blood Moon war cry. The field of amber lights below surged forward. The siege had begun. Ilara pushed herself up from the snow, her body aching, the carved candle holder still clutched in her frozen hand. She was outside, but she was exposed in open ground between a fortress bent on killing her and an army about to storm it. And Cashen was still inside, surrounded. As the first flaming arrows from Blood Moon's archers streaked through the night sky, arcing over her head to slam into the stronghold's wooden gates, Ilara realized the horrifying truth. She hadn't stopped the war. She had simply run onto the battlefield. The world became a symphony of chaos, the whoosh of flaming arrows, the thunder of the battering ram against the gate, the screams of warriors, and beneath it all, the relentless unifying howl of the Blood Moon pack. Ilara crouched in the snowdrift, a tiny, insignificant figure caught between two colliding titans. Archers on the wall above were now distracted, returning fire into the darkness, their arrows aimed at the advancing sea of amber-eyed wolves. Gareth's priority had shifted from her to the siege. She had to move, staying put was death. Scrambling on hands and knees, she used the shadows at the base of the massive outer wall for cover, heading not away from the fortress, but parallel to it, toward the main gate. It was the last place anyone would expect her to go. Her mind had one frantic goal: get back inside. Cashen was in there, surrounded. He had fought to protect her, she couldn't just run. As she moved, the giant oak gates shuddered under a massive impact. A crack splintered the thick wood. On the next thunderous blow, the iron brace snapped. The gates exploded inward. Pouring through the breach was the Blood Moon army. They were not a disorganized horde. They moved in disciplined units, a mix of human forms with weapons and massive, sleek wolves with glowing eyes. At their forefront was a giant silver-furred wolf, bigger than any other, his muzzle streaked with gray. Lysander. He shifted as he crossed the threshold, becoming a formidable man with a battle-axe already in hand, his roar a command that sent his forces fanning out into the courtyard. The Frostfang defenders, already demoralized by the prisoner revolt and the sudden attack, began to break. Many threw down their weapons, submitting instantly to the overwhelming dominance radiating from the Blood Moon beater. Others fought, but they were pushed back toward the stronghold's main doors. Ilara used the tidal wave of invaders as a shield, slipping in through the shattered gate amidst the confusion. The main courtyard was a nightmare of clashing steel and snarls. She pressed herself against the inner wall, searching the fray for one face. Then she saw him. Cashen emerged from a doorway high on the central staircase, like a storm-given form. He had clearly fought his way up from the dungeon level. He held a captured sword, and his expression was one of terrifying, absolute fury. He wasn't just fighting, he was carving a path of pure intimidation, his alpha aura now fully unleashed, making lesser wolves cower and lose their will to fight. His amber eyes scanned the battlefield, not looking at the tactical lines, but searching desperately for something. For her. Their eyes met across the smoke and chaos. A Frostfang enforcer, seeing Cashen distracted, lunged at his back with a spear. Cashen didn't even turn. He caught the spear shaft mid-thrust, snapped it, and backhanded the man off the staircase with casual, brutal force, never breaking his gaze from Ilara. He began moving toward her, a force of nature descending the steps, when Alpha Kieran intercepted him. Kieran had shifted. He was a massive, ice-colored wolf, teeth bared, blocking Cashen's path. This was the challenge, Alpha to Alpha. The courtyard seemed to hold its breath as the two leaders faced each other. Cashen didn't shift. He stood in human form, bloody sword in hand, and spoke, his voice carrying over the din. Kieran Frostfang, you stole me, you tortured me, you threatened an innocent to try to chain me again. Your rule ends tonight. Submit. Kieran answered with a snarling lunge. The fight was short, brutal, and utterly one-sided. Cashen moved with a preternatural speed, dodging Kieran's claws, his sword a blur of silver. He wasn't trying to kill, he was dismantling. A precise cut to the hamstring brought the great wolf crashing down. A blow from the pummel to the skull dazed him. Before Kieran could recover, Cashen placed a boot on his neck, pinning the alpha wolf to the stone, his sword point hovering above Kieran's eye. Submit, Cashen commanded again, his voice the final, echoing judgment. The ice-colored wolf went limp, a low whine of submission escaping its throat. The symbol was undeniable. The Frostfang Alpha was defeated. A great cry went up from the Blood Moon warriors. A groan of despair came from the remaining Frostfang fighters. As one, they dropped their weapons. The battle was over. Cashen didn't spare Kieran another glance. He shoved the defeated Alpha toward a waiting Lysander. Secure him. Then he was moving again, striding through the suddenly still courtyard. Ilara stood frozen as he approached. He was splattered with blood, his clothes torn, radiating power and violence. But when he reached her, he dropped to one knee, bringing himself to her eye level. The terrifying Alpha King was gone. In his eyes was only a fierce, desperate relief. "You are hurt," he said, his voice rough. He gently touched a cut on her forehead from her fall. "I'm fine," she whispered, her own voice trembling. "My family, Kieran said he would." "Lysander," Cashen barked without looking away from her. The silver-haired beater was instantly at his side. "My king. Send a swift unit to the lower village. Find an Omega woman named Marin and a boy named Finn. Protect them, bring them here. No one is to touch them." "It will be done." Lysander gave Ilara a long, appraising look that held a newfound respect, then moved to carry out the order. Cashen stood, pulling Ilara up with him. He kept her hand firmly in his as he turned to address the assembled packs. Frostfang members knelt in the snow. Blood Moon warriors stood at attention. "Hear me," Cashen's voice boomed across the courtyard. "The Frostfang Alpha is deposed for crimes of kidnapping, torture, and deceit that brought you to the brink of annihilation. His beater, Gareth, sought to murder an innocent to cover these crimes. Where is he?" A Blood Moon warrior dragged a beaten, sullen Gareth forward and forced him to his knees beside his Alpha. "Justice," Cashen said, the word cold and final, "will be decided by the combined council of both packs. But this I decree now, the war is over. The past belongs to Blood Moon as it always should have. But the Frostfang pack is not destroyed. You will be integrated, you will have a voice. You will follow new laws where strength does not mean cruelty and rank does not justify tyranny." He then looked down at Ilara beside him. This Omega Ilara showed more courage, compassion, and loyalty than any Alpha in this fortress. While your leaders schemed for power, she risked everything for a stranger's life. She is the reason I am free. She is the reason this war ended before it consumed you all. From this moment, she is under my personal protection. To harm her, to slight her, to even look at her with disrespect, is to challenge me directly. Do you understand? A unified murmur of assent rose from the crowd, Frostfang and Blood Moon alike. The power reversal was absolute. The lowest had been lifted up by the highest in front of everyone. In the days that followed, the stronghold transformed. Kieran and Gareth were placed under heavy guard, awaiting the formal council. Blood Moon warriors secured the perimeter, but there was no pillaging, no brutality. Cashen's orders were strict: protect the civilians, restore order. Ilara's aunt and cousin were brought to the fortress, scared but unharmed. They were given warm rooms in the guest quarters, their shock at Ilara's new status plain on their faces. For Ilara, the world had changed too fast to process. She was given chambers of her own, not in the attic, but in the sunlit eastern wing. She refused to be idle. She helped organize the distribution of food from the storerooms to the frightened lower-ranking pack members. She tended to the wounded alongside the healers. She moved through the halls, and now, instead of being ignored, wolves of all ranks dipped their heads in respect. It was unsettling. A week after the battle, Cashen found her in the herb garden, trying to salvage some frostbitten medicinal plants. He approached quietly, having shed his warrior demeanor for simple, dark clothes. "You're avoiding the Great Hall," he said. "There are still things here that need doing," she replied, not looking up. "Ilara," his tone made her stop. She turned. He looked serious but not angry. "Walk with me." He led her not to the hall, but up to the same eastern battlement where Gareth had thrown her. The view was clear now, the Blood Moon camp orderly in the distance, the pass open and secure. "You are free," Cashen said, leaning on the parapet. "Truly free. You can go anywhere. Your family will be provided for. You could take them south, to the human towns, start a new life with enough gold to never be cold or hungry again." Her heart constricted. Was this his way of saying thank you and goodbye? Is that what you want? "What I want," he said, turning to face her, his amber eyes intense, is for you to choose, without fear, without obligation. I owe you my life, my kingdom's stability. That debt can never be repaid, but obligation is a poor foundation for anything. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. The bond we formed in that cell was real. It was trust forged in the dark. But outside the dark, things are different. You could have a quiet life. She looked out at the mountains, then back at his face, seeing the king, the warrior, and the prisoner who had taken her bread. When I was in the dark with you, she said slowly, I felt less alone than I ever had in the bright halls of my own pack. A quiet life sounds like another kind of cage. I don't want your gold, Cashen, and I'm not afraid of you. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the first true one she had ever seen from him. Good, he murmured, because I have a proposition, one that requires your mind, not your submission. The integration of Frostfang will be a delicate disaster if handled by soldiers alone. They need administration, fair trade, a new structure. I need someone who knows this pack, its people, its hidden strengths and flaws. Someone they will trust more than they trust me. I need a liaison. A voice for them within my court. He was offering her a position, real power, real responsibility, not as a mate or a consort, but as an advisor. It was more respect than she had ever dreamed of. You'd trust me with that. I trusted you with the key to my chains, he said simply. This is just logistics. She laughed, the sound surprising her, then she sobered. And where would this liaison live? Cashen's eyes gleamed. Wherever she wishes, but my court is at Bloodmoon Keep. It's warmer there, the libraries are extensive, and I am told the view from the advisor's tower is exceptional. The final, surprising detail wasn't a declaration of love or a mate bond. It was better. It was an invitation to stand beside him as an equal in purpose. He was offering her a future she had built with her own courage, not one granted by a bond or a title. Ilara looked from the mountains she had always known to the man who had overturned her world. She thought of the ledgers she could balance, the people she could help, the quiet strength she could wield. She nodded. Then I suppose, she said, a new confidence settling in her voice, I should see about packing. The story of Ilara and Cashen is more than a simple reversal of fortune. It's a blueprint for how the most fragile bonds can become the strongest foundations of power. In a world obsessed with dominance, a single act of compassion, offered without expectation of reward, shattered an entire regime. The Frostfang stronghold fell not to siege engines, but to the moral bankruptcy of its own leader, a collapse that began the moment an Omega chose to see a prisoner as a person. This narrative forces us to question the very architecture of power. Alpha Kieran believed strength was about control, fear, and visible hierarchy. He was wrong. True strength, as Cashen demonstrated, is the confidence to show mercy, to integrate rather than obliterate, and to recognize value in the most unexpected places. The most secure throne is one surrounded by loyalty earned through respect, not terror. For Ilara, the journey was never about ascending a ranking. It was about discovering her own agency. She moved from being defined by her pack's rules to defining a new role for herself, built on competence, courage, and an unwavering moral compass. Her power came not from a title bestowed by an alpha, but from the quiet authority she claimed for herself in the dark and carried into the light. So the next time you feel insignificant in a rigid system, remember the Omega with the bowl of broth. Remember that the chains of tradition are often just as breakable as spelled silver if you have the right leverage, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is not a loud declaration, but a quiet, consistent refusal to accept that cruelty is simply the way things are. What kind of world could we build if we all had the courage to feed the stranger in the dark, not knowing who they might become? If you were captivated by this story of hidden strength and deserved justice, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that more stories like this deserve to be told. Share this video with anyone who loves a tale where kindness is the ultimate power play. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell. Your support fuels our deep dives into the narratives that remind us that every underdog has their day, and every act of decency sends a ripple through the world. Let me know in the comments below, what was the moment you knew Alpha Kieran's reign was truly over? Was it the shattered chains, the broken gate, or the quiet look of respect from a king to the woman who saved him. I read every single one. Until next time, remember, even the smallest candle can light the way out of the deepest dungeon.